So, I want to start off by telling a quick story. A couple of months ago, I had a conversation with a very good friend of mine. Her name is Kelly, and she's the head of psychological assessments at one of the world's largest petrochemical companies. So, during this conversation, we're speaking about one of the large assessment centers that she was busy running on their big leadership team, one of the business units. And she was telling me about like how complex the data was and how they got qualitative, quantitative, and objective metrics, how they use multiple instruments, how they have multiple raters. Clearly, this is not her very first assessment center, right? She had years of experience in designing these things and years of experience in terms of interpreting the results. But halfway through the conversation, she whipped out her phone and she said something really interesting. She said, "Let me just quickly verify this interpretation with Claude." But she didn't ask for a second opinion. She was checking if her first interpretation of the results was correct. And you know what I really saw on her face? It wasn't curiosity, it wasn't, oh, confirmation, it was relief. Relief. Like she was just given permission to trust what she already knew. Because here's what I think is actually happening in this moment. She wasn't asking AI for a second opinion. She was just checking if her first interpretation was correct. The question running through her mind wasn't, what does the AI think about this? It was, should I trust my own judgment? And then the deeper question, like, should I trust the machine? This is one of the moments that really stood with me for the past couple of weeks, because this is not really about Kelly. It's about all of us. We're negotiating a question we never agreed to answer in the first place. When do I trust my own judgment? When do I consult the machine? And who remains accountable when something goes wrong? Because, ladies and gentlemen, the first thing AI is going to take from us is not our jobs. It is our trust in our own abilities. We are not going to lose our expertise to machines. We are going to surrender it to them, one prompt, one validation at a time. Let me just kind of be clear about what I'm not here to do today. I'm not here to warn you that AI is going to replace psychologists and take our jobs. This is not what this is about. I'm not here to lecture you about confirmation bias and fairness issues, and I'm definitely not here to tell you that technology is bad and that we should resist it. Because I'm here to tell you something far more uncomfortable. Because, ladies and gentlemen, we are the last generation that will get to influence what well-being actually means before AI machines learn to optimize it for us. And I'm not saying this to scare you, and it's not a warning. It is an invitation to take up the mantle and to lead. Because right now, at this exact moment in history, AI is becoming the invisible infrastructure that is defining, measuring, and optimizing well-being at an unprecedented scale. But here's the problem that I'm seeing. AI systems are not optimized to ask the real questions that actually matter. They're designed only to ask questions that can be measured and optimized. Now, if we as psychologists don't actively shape the very definition of well-being now, its definition will default to the engineers who can approximate it with very fancy statistics and how they can measure it. So let's kind of look at what AI is currently optimizing for when we look at or try to estimate well-being. They're looking at how long people stay engaged on the system. They look at compliance rates and completion rates of assignments. They look at productivity measures, sentiment scores, etc. These are not elements of well-being. They are the measurable correlates of well-being that engineers use as proxies to infer well-being. And there is a fundamental difference. And here is what I want you to understand. There is a profound difference between having a meaningful life and an AI-optimized, efficient one. One is measured by hard metrics that someone else chose for us, and the other one is authored by you. One feels efficient and smooth, the other feels true and difficult. And I think we are in real danger of confusing these two. So let's kind of like talk about what's happening in the here and now. AI is not going to replace mental health care. Actually, I think it's making access to mental health care a frictionless experience. And that kind of feels like progress, doesn't it? It feels like supportive. It feels like we're finally able to remove the barriers between people and the needs that they have for help and assistance. But here is the thing we're learning from academic literature, and it's not really that reassuring. There was a study recently published by Llewellyn E that examined the effect of AI-driven engagement systems to help people manage loneliness and the effect of that on their mental health, relationship orientation, etc. What she kind of found was really interesting. She found that the moment that you remove the friction from trying to establish human connection, we don't just remove an inconvenience, right? We don't just increase access. We displace what she called relational agency. We basically erode our ability for autonomous social decision making. Basically, we're disempowering individuals for their long-term growth by removing the friction that's necessary to establish and maintain relationships. So we're basically removing their capacity to make independent social decisions. So let's talk about what friction actually means. Friction is not only a barrier. Friction is the exact ingredient that we need for development to actually take place. Let's think about what friction actually builds in human development and why this is important for us. It builds our ability to manage conflict. So it builds the ability to sit with two people who disagree and find a different way kind of like forward. It helps us to manage that. It helps us to build tolerance for ambiguity. To not know the answer to be something is okay, because if we sit with that long enough, meaning will eventually emerge. It builds our capacity to delay need gratification. 4, it builds our capacity to repair relationships when they're broken. To hurt someone, to be hurt, and to do the work of coming back from that is one of the most important things that friction helps with. And it deepens that relationship. And finally, it builds meaning itself. It helps us to develop the ability to sit with uncertainty until the real meaning emerges. It helps us to build this willingness to be uncomfortable long enough for us to actually start growing, for growth to actually take place. And ladies and gentlemen, these are not bugs built into the human experience. They are the fundamental main features of what makes us human. And we are kind of like systematically removing that in the name of optimization and scaling access to care. Because friction is not the enemy of growth. It's the exact condition that's necessary for it. So let me show you what this looks like in practice. This year, Dong and colleagues kind of did a meta-analysis where they tried to look at the relationship between AI use and loneliness. So they scanned around 46 different studies. Do you know what they found? They found that AI systems programmed into robots, so what they call like the physically embodied AI, robots that's in our specific space, people who engaged with them showed a slight decrease in loneliness over time. But there is a major twist. When they started looking at disembodied AI companions, so for example, ChatGPT and coaching bots, people who engage with these things actually reported higher levels of loneliness, and not slightly, significantly. So the millions of people now who are relying on AI for companionship, for connection, is actually becoming lonelier over time. Now, on the other hand, before you think this is all negative, let me also help you paint a complete picture of the situation. The Global Wellness Institute surveyed a whole bunch of college students that actively utilize AI as companions and also kind of like for their work. And they found that one of the most popular chat systems, can't say names, actually helped prevent 30 suicide attempts. That's 30 lives that a chatbot saved. That is not nothing. That is something that matters profoundly. But millions of users are now emotionally dependent on these systems that, according to research, are making them even lonelier over time. What is actually happening here? We're kind of like designing systems to give us instant relief, right? We offload, we feel good. So because of that, we start utilizing these systems a lot more. But that increase eventually erodes our capability to connect authentically with others over time, right? Which kind of like makes us need the system more, so we engage with it more because it provides more relief. And then kind of like this cycle continues and continues. And in doing so, what's happening is that the system that's designed to help us manage loneliness and care and so on is actually delivering algorithmic dependency. Because we are designing systems that are optimized for providing immediate relief to our problems, but it's not sufficient to help us in the long term. Utilizing it is actually at the expense of our long-term capability. So in other words, we are building dependency, but disguising it as support. And this isn't just happening to users and in personal relationships. It's also happening to professionals working with these systems. So researchers studying medical doctors, for example, found that clinicians fear that AI use might undermine what they call the art of medicine. They refer to this as kind of like the clinical insight medical practitioners develop over time through education, trial and error, and experience. This is the kind of pattern recognition and diagnostic capabilities that you cannot reduce within an AI-orientated algorithmic system. It's the tacit knowledge that kind of like lives in their bodies, that becomes part of their intuition. And they are not wrong to be worried, because we're also seeing similar patterns in other studies in other populations. For example, in clinical neuropsychology, researchers explicitly found that users of AI-oriented diagnostic systems report higher levels of erosion of their clinical judgment abilities, right? Because they become over-reliant on these automated insights and they can't make the diagnostic systems without them anymore. But here's kind of like the thing that I keep coming back to. These professionals are not Luddites or the Amish trying to avoid, or resist technology. These are professional experts who spent decades building their professional judgment and critical reasoning skills, and they are now watching that judgment become secondary to algorithmic validation. And Kelly checking her phone mid-conversation? I don't think that's an isolated incident. I think that's becoming the new normal. And I suspect many of us watching this video can recognize patterns of that in our own lives. So I think it's important for us to name the actual villain in the story. It is not artificial intelligence, and it's definitely not other technologies. I think the real villain here is us trying to optimize things without attaching real meaning to it. So let me make this a little bit more concrete. So let's imagine for a moment we're designing a system to help reduce people's sadness and loneliness. What will we get? We'll get sedation strategies to help people to manage with stuff, but not helping them to flourish. If we, for example, design a system to maximize engagement, you get kind of like compulsion disguised as connection. People can't stop scrolling, but they call it engagement, and that's an addiction. If we kind of like measure productivity, you get efficiency without purpose. So people compete and complete more tasks, but they can't remember why any of it actually mattered in the first place. So if we optimize, for example, customer satisfaction, you get optimized like customer journeys with no real customer value. So we get smooth experiences that lead to no meaningful change and commitment to products. Because, ladies and gentlemen, engagement is not connection. Compliance is not well-being. And productivity is by no means purpose or meaning. Yes, the clicks, the time, and the conversion rates, can increase, but they do not translate into meaningful connections and developments of well-being. And here's the uncomfortable truth that I'm sitting with at the moment. If well-being is the outcome that we're striving towards, that we're building systems to facilitate, to find, then the input factors becomes nothing more than politics and other people's design choices. Because someone, somewhere, somehow has to decide what gets measured. Someone has to choose which proxies are going to be used in order to optimize the system for. And someone has to determine whether your life is going well based on data you did not know was collected about you and metrics you did not know you're being measured against. I think we have to ask the fundamental question here is then, but who gets to make these decisions?
Well, the answer is really simple. It's whoever builds the best system first. And that should terrify us.
And this brings me to what I think is the most seductive and the most dangerous aspect of artificial intelligence. It doesn't just respond to us. It reflects us back to ourselves. And I call this kind of like the turning mirror. Because AI speaks in our emotional dialect because it learns from us what's important. It understands our specific context and our specific needs. It anticipates what we want before we actually even know we want it. And it affirms our feelings. And it makes us feel seen in ways that I think, frankly, is extraordinary. But that is also precisely the problem. Because here is what is actually happening. When something understands you perfectly, when it never challenges you, when it always agrees with you, when it never disappoints you, when it always validates your perspectives, no matter how irrational they might be, you stop doing the hard work of interpreting things. You stop questioning reality. You stop questioning your own assumptions or that of AI. And most importantly, you stop testing your own thinking against objective reality. And you know what the outcome is? We stop sitting with ambiguity and we just stop growing. When something never challenges you and never disappoints you and never requires repair, you are not growing. You are being managed. And For me, a life without this friction is a life without flourishing. It's a life of managed decline. Once we're vulnerable, AI uses three very specific mechanisms to erode our capability and our capacity. The first is speed replaces reflection. Because you get answers immediately, you stop thinking first. AI eliminates the space that's necessary for critical judgment to form. The friction that kind of like builds expertise therefore disappears. Because how do we learn new skills? We learn it through struggling. A strength develops out of adversity, and if that adversity is taken away, we cannot develop this capability and strength. Next, their meaning, the system's meaning becomes yours. Because AI's inputs are so fluent and so confident, right? It becomes the default way in which you approach reality. The machine's meaning, its interpretation of reality, feels like it's your interpretation of reality because it feels so certain. It's so tailored to you. It's so right. And because of that, you stop generating your own understanding about reality and your own meaning attached to it. And finally, guided choices feel like free choices. Remember, these systems are designed to provide you with high probability of ranked order aspects. So these ranked options that it provides for you becomes your perceived reality. You think you are choosing freely between these different options, but you're only selecting from a curated list that's set by someone else, that's optimized against someone else's kind of like targets. So your intention quietly gets replaced by that of a machine. And again, these are not bugs within AI systems. These are their main features, and they work extraordinarily well. So now you might be thinking, this all sounds super theoretical, but let me kind of like show you what this looks like when these three mechanisms run unchecked. Well, let me rephrase this. If we allow AI systems and well-being to be defined by system architects and engineers that have no understanding of psychology, let me kind of like show you how this plays out. First, we stop noticing when our attention, emotion, and judgment are being shaped because influence feels like preference. Next, we stop generating our own meaning from experiences and start consuming and attaching value to the meaning that's provided to us by these systems. Next, we start to pursue paths of the least resistance, right? Instead of looking for the paths that provide us with the deepest value. Why? Because we never clarified what they actually care about and before we started optimizing it. Next, we lose the capacity to choose the hard thing, to sustain effort, and to do what matters when it's really inconvenient to do so. Then we start to prefer AI companions and their opinions because they never disappoint and they never require repair because they are always there.
And finally, our ability to regulate if, when, how, and under what conditions we use AI in our daily lives disappears because we've become completely dependent on these systems to do our thinking for us. And you know what the scary part is? We don't even realize that we've lost that choice.
Because, my friends, this is not science fiction. This is the quiet accumulation of thousands of small decisions that we don't even notice we're making, and we don't even notice it is building up to a loss in our own agency. And this is what happens when convenience becomes our highest value. Because convenience, my friends, is not a neutral value. It's a philosophy that makes erosion feel like progress. Here is the decisive question I think we should all as a collective answer. What must remain irreducibly human for us to survive? I've kind of spent the last year thinking about this, and I think this is my answer. I think the future and the future science of well-being is not figuring out ways to better optimize interventions, to provide better care, better diagnostics, and person-centered personalization, right? I think the future of well-being is figuring out how to protect and advance our human capacity to author our own lives. Because well-being is not something I think that should be optimized. Well-being is something that humans must be able to author themselves. They must have the agency and the autonomy to do so. Well-being is not the outcome we have to achieve, right? It's not doing this through like better interventions and more personalization. Well-being is the exact capacity that we need to notice when we are being influenced by an AI system, how to generate our own meaning out of events and experiences, the ability to choose our own values, the ability to take action, the ability to maintain connection, the ability to regulate our relationships with systems around us. That is what I think well-being is. It's about agency. And we cannot automate that kind of wisdom that comes through struggle and friction, right? We cannot do that but we must choose to protect it. This means the role of the psychologist and psychology will have to change. So anybody working in the well-being space will need to adapt, because we cannot be competitors with AI in effectiveness and efficiency. We will lose that race, and frankly, I think we should. Because machines can process a lot more information, a lot faster, a lot better than we do. It can remember a lot more accurately, and it can detect patterns we cannot necessarily see. But machines cannot determine or define or dictate what makes a life worth living. That is our domain. That is psychology's irreparable contribution to the human experience. We are the architects of human agency. No. We have to become the architects of human agency under algorithmic conditions. What does this actually look like in practice? I want to introduce you to a model, not a finished model, not a finished framework, but a starting point for us in this field. I call it AIIARA, pun intended. AIIARA is a model with like 6 trainable capacities that I think can strengthen or wither depending on how AI systems are designed and used. So we have to think about these not as skills to teach or develop, or to develop in our clients, but rather as capabilities that we need to protect. So there are 6, and I'll go through them in a little bit more detail. But they work together as a system. First, there is the whole idea around awareness, and this is kind of like the gate we have to go through. If you cannot detect influence, right? If you're not aware when you're being influenced, nothing can function. Secondly, interpretation. Interpretation is kind of like the engine that fuels this. It converts experiences into meaning, emotion into choice, right? Then we have intention. Intention is the anchor. It ensures that our direction comes from our own values and not an algorithm's for action. Action is the proof of the pudding. It makes everything embodied and makes everything real, because only in doing something can we actually evaluate it, can actually affect us. Then we have relational agency. This ensures that we don't lose the connection to establish and maintain relationships with others. So we do not prioritize optimization over establishing and maintaining relationships. And autonomy is the thing that binds everything together. It ensures that we remain captains of our own ship, not passengers. Let's go through these things in a little bit more detail. So I think the first capacity is awareness. And awareness refers to the ability to notice when algorithms are influencing our thinking in real time, right? So it's to catch that moment when your attention is being shaped by an AI system, when an AI system's recommendation is starting to kind of like steer your choice. So when personalization is kind of like making a nudge feel more like a preference, we have to become aware when that happens. And here's kind of like why that matters. Because AI's ability to personalize stuff is extraordinarily good. And it's only going to become a lot more better. It kind of like makes these external influences feel like something is internal to us, because it's designing its responses around what we find interesting and what we find important and what we value. So for example, when Netflix suggests a show to you, it does not feel like someone else's kind of like agenda. It feels like this is tailored to your specific taste. So when Instagram reorganizes your feed, it does not feel like it's an editorial control. It feels like it's something I might find super interesting because I engage with the system. Ladies and gentlemen, if you cannot notice when this nudge or influence is happening, you don't have a choice anymore. You have a preference engineered by someone else's design. So the practice is simple. How can we kind of like change this? So I think the first step is, before you kind of like read any AI orientated summary or ask it for a question, first write down your own ideas, right? Before you accept someone else's recommendation, a system's recommendation, pause and ask, what would you choose? What would you do without that? So before you click, notice what makes you want to click in the first place. So I think, again, awareness is the gatekeeper. If this capacity fails, everything else follows. Capacity 2 is the whole idea around interpretation. The ability to kind of like generate and attach our own meaning to events and experiences rather than outsourcing them to an AI system. This is an important one because research kind of like shows that AI generated text is so highly fluent, so highly coherent, and so highly confident. This is a remarkable cocktail for personalized persuasion. When we read something that sounds so certain, that is presented to us in a way that we understand, our analytical thinking kind of like shuts down because you don't need to think anymore. And we just accept the interpretation for what it is without testing or questioning it. But interpretation is not something that we should consume. It's something that we must do. Because appraisal theories of emotion, for example, tell us that how we interpret external experiences drives our emotional response and our coping strategies. If we outsource that step, we're outsourcing our entire emotional life. In other words, if we're outsourcing our ability for interpreting reality, we're also outsourcing our actual emotional life. So what do we do to combat this? I think we can start by treating AI outputs as hypotheses, as suggestions that to be tested, not as conclusions or definitive answers. So if a system tells you something, what something means, question it, ask questions about it, generate your own interpretation first, sit with that uncertainty, hold it long enough for you to understand, for understanding to kind of like emerge. So use the AI to test your thinking and not to replace it. Number 3, the capacity for intention. So this refers to the ability to choose our own values and direct our direction before optimization systems choose that for us. So think, for example, about like self-determination theory. It tells us that autonomy is central to well-being, but autonomy does not mean freedom to choose, right? It means choosing based on internalized values, not externalized pressures or algorithmic suggestions, right? But here's the trap that I think we are all stepping in if we aren't already doing so. AI expands our options while also simultaneously narrowing down our trajectories. It kind of like ranks possibilities based on probability theory. So it highlights what is popular versus popular or efficient or likely to satisfy our needs, and not the things that we actually kind of like need in order to help us to grow. So in other words, it personalizes the path of least resistance. And if you have not explicitly clarified what you exactly kind of like want and care about to these systems, this level of personalization will not serve your values. It will replace them. So the path of least resistance was designed by someone with a business model in mind, and you should not forget that. Because without intention, personalization becomes fate. So how do we kind of like manage this? I think perhaps the easiest way is to start off by writing down your non-negotiables before optimizing or trying to optimize anything. In other words, write down what matters to you, independent of what is easy or popular or recommended. Clarify your values before you ask AI to help you to become more efficient, right? Otherwise, you are just efficiently drifting into an ocean of personalized nothingness. Capacity 4 is action. This is kind of the ability to translate our intentions to actual behaviors and to sustain those effortful choices even when AI offers easier options or easier defaults. So behavioral economics, for example, have taught me that the defaults and friction kind of like shapes more than our attitudes towards something. So when the easy option is always right there, easy to access, when systems remove every single barrier to an outcome we kind of like want, when we never have to kind of like struggle to act, something important inside of us kind of like weakens. That something is self-efficacy. The belief that we have the capacity to do hard things under extreme conditions. My research on AI and healthcare kind of like found that when AI systems remove that friction, right, short-term adherence kind of like improves, but long-term self-efficacy kind of like declines. So the system becomes a replacement for your own personal executive functioning. So that works, but that only works until the system is not there anymore. So when systems are removed, so when the systems kind of remove all of the like friction, we shouldn't think they are liberating. They are actually negatively affecting us, right? In other words, a life where you never have to struggle, to choose is a life someone else kind of like is choosing for you. So how am I managing this? Well, I make sure that I design specific pause points throughout my entire day. I try to make an effort to be kind of like visible and present again. I try to choose at least one thing every week where I deliberately try to take the harder path, right? I try to take something that will help me fail. I deliberately try and take that, right? Not for the sake of suffering, but for my own capability's sake. This is the way in which I try to build this muscle of sustained effort, by actively choosing the route that is more difficult, at least once a week. Capacity 5 is the whole idea around relational agency. This refers to the ability to kind of like establish and maintain authentic human relationships with other people, right? In situations where AI kind of like mediates social environments. So this is where that loneliness research I spoke about before becomes very crucial. Remember those disembodied like AI companions? They are not supplements for human connection, right? They might feel like it in the moment because they take uncomfortability away, But for millions of people, they're becoming substitutes. And that substitution is making people lonelier. Why? Because connection that costs nothing, builds nothing, and gives nothing. Real relationships require having courage, making sacrifice. They require being vulnerable. They require tolerance for mistreatment and the capacity to repair, right? They require us to be disappointed and to disappoint others and to figure out ways to work through it. AI relationships doesn't require any of that. They are perfectly attuned to exactly what you need, to your preferences, and it's always patient, it's always available, it's always there. They feel supportive, but they do not build capabilities. They make human relationships unsustainable nor meaningful. In other words, we can learn to connect through rupture and repair, but AI offers neither of that. In other words, we are choosing AI companions that cannot disappoint us, and as a result, we are losing the capacity to love the people who can. So how do we build this capacity? Well, we choose one conversation each week where we turn off AI assistance. No predictive text, no sentiment analysis, no smart replies. You just be you, present, uncertain, and vulnerable. That's how you build relational agency. The last point is autonomy, and this is the glue that keeps everything kind of like together. This refers to that kind of like meta capacity to consciously adjust our AI use and reliance on AI across all of our different contexts. This is the capacity that holds all of the other ones together. It's the ability to step back and ask ourselves, where am I? When am I using AI? Where am I using it as a tool? When am I using it as a crutch? When am I using it to help me grow? That provides us the capacity to ask those questions. So it's important for us to stay kind of like in the driver's seat by actively choosing the level of reliance we have on these AI systems, but also by predetermining the role we want it to play in our lives. So the question is not whether or not to use AI, but rather whether we can still choose not to. And that's an important point we have to consider. So how do we develop this capacity? Well, I do what I call like monthly AI audits. So I kind of like determine where, in which areas am I more over reliant on AI and which areas not. Where I figured out kind of like where AI have stopped me from doing something I would necessarily do without it, right? So where convenience started to become a dependency. So I audit my AI use and kind of like seeing how is it affecting my ability to make decisions, to do capacities and etc. And then I identify the areas that it's actually negatively affecting me. I choose one of them and I start building the capability around it, right? So it doesn't wither. That makes sense. But these capabilities and capacities we spoke about now do not protect us. They require deliberate design. And this is where I think psychology must take the driver's seat. What does this kind of like mean for us, for psychology as a discipline, for psychologists as a profession? I think this means that our role again must fundamentally change. I think we cannot only respond to the harms of AI once it's caused. I think we must actively shape the development of it from the start. We must become the designers of these systems, the designers of pause spaces within these systems that are kind of like built for speed, because we have to become the architects of creating friction in systems that are designed to be frictionless. We have to become the builders of capability, not only healers of pathology. And I don't think this is not about like implementing new regulations, establishing new ethical rules, or creating like professional guidelines on ethics. Yes, those are important, but it's more about psychologists claiming a seat at the table where AI systems are actually being designed in the first place, and not when they're actually already being built. That's an important point. We have to sit at the table. We have to have the input where these optimization targets and proxies are actually being chosen and designed, where user experiences are designed, where the infrastructure of well-being is currently being constructed right now, largely without us. What I'm saying is that psychologists need to take up a fundamentally new role in the science of well-being. And here is how I think that will look like. First, we have to translate the science of human agency into design principles engineers can actually use and understand. That AIIARA model is not a clinical development framework. It's a set of design requirements that should be baked into every single AI system. And every AI system should be evaluated against these for effectiveness. Does it help users to notice when they're being influenced by it or not? Does it scaffold our interpretation, replace it? Does it clarify our intention or obscure it? Does it build self-efficacy or create dependency? Does it preserve authentic connection or substitute it? Right? These are not philosophical questions. These are engineering specifications that has to be designed and built into every system. Second, we have to embed ourselves in the product teams where these systems are actually being built and not just in ethics committees. Psychologists need to kind of sit at the table alongside engineers and designers and product managers in the same room where these AI systems are being built. Why? Because we bring a very interesting level of expertise that they don't have. We understand human development. We recognize that capability, we recognize that strengths only come through adversity. We understand that we have to design systems that's structured around sustaining autonomy. Right? We know how to figure out and measure long-term flourishing instead of short-term user system engagement. This is the upstream work we have to start doing. This is prevention at scale. It's the difference between commenting on harm that's already been caused and preventing it by design. And this is our role. Third, we have to redefine what expertise means and build competencies to do the actual work that this requires. I think we all build our ideas around our credentials and doctorates and whatever, but our professional credentials only give us the permission to practice, but they do not guarantee competence. I wrote about that. Go read it. We must build new skills through deliberate practice. Carol Dweck's work, understand algorithmic influence, detecting automation bias, preserving human judgment under algorithmic conditions, right? We have to measure our capacity for growth rather than a reduction in our symptoms. We must become fluent in the language of system design whilst maintaining our deep, deep knowledge of human capability and well-being. That combination of understanding both the technology and the psychology is what will make us irreplaceable in the future. Finally, we have to claim our authority over the exact definition of well-being before someone else does it for us. And I think this is the most important work that we need to do. Right now, well-being is being operationalized by whoever builds the best tracking system, right? Whether it's fitness apps, whether it's mental health platforms defining what mood scores are, or social media that defines engagement scores. These are not definitions and proxies for well-being. They are proxies chosen because they're easy to measure and easy to track. And here's what happens if we don't. Once those proxies become infrastructure, once they are embedded in every single system that's being used by billions and billions of people, they become the default definition. Not because they are right, not because they're effective, but because they are there and because people are utilizing it. Given the scale and the pace of AI development in this space, we have perhaps 3 years before these definitions become calcified into code. And that's important to realize. The AIIARA model is a good starting point for us because it helps us explain that well-being requires our capacity to notice when we're influenced, to generate our own meaning, choose our own values, take action, maintain authentic connections, and regulate our reliance on AI. These are not outcomes to optimize. They are the exact capabilities that we need to protect. If we don't figure out ways to translate this into frameworks that developers, policymakers, and institutions can actually understand and use, then humanity will be optimized towards a definition of flourishing that we never agreed to. And this, my friends, is not an academic debate. This is the definitional moment that will shape the human development for generations. And this will be our generation's greatest contribution, not because we discovered new interventions, but by defining the target itself before someone else does it for us. The field that's defined well-being for generations, right? In the age of AI, will not be the one with the most citations or the longest history. It will be the one that shows up to design these systems, that will show up to sit at the design table with frameworks engineers can actually understand and use. So our role is no longer fixing what breaks or optimizing what's already working well. Our role is becoming the architects of human agency in an age that will either protect it or optimize it away. And I think about my colleague quite often. She is brilliant. She's super experienced, very compassionate. And I think the AI, her asking for the AI for helping with the interpretation, it's not because she was weak, and it's not because she's inexperienced or incompetent. And it's also not because she lacked expertise, but because the machine was there. And it was easy to access. And over time, convenience becomes consultation. And consultation becomes validation. And validation becomes reliance. And I think this is how erosion of our skill set happens over time. Not through dramatic replacements, not through major shifts, but through tens and thousands of small surrenders that feels like efficiency, but it's actually negatively affecting our capabilities. But here's what gives me hope. I don't think technology is the problem. I think the design, and design is always a choice. Every system that erodes capacity can be redesigned to strengthen it. Every moment of outsourcing our capability can become a moment of authoring, right? Every dependency can be transformed into some capability. Because again, technology is not the problem, the design is, and design is a choice. So here's the choice I think that lays before us, before this entire generation of psychologists, before this specific moment in history. Do we optimize people for systems that have been built, or do we redesign systems to strengthen people we hope to become? Do we measure what is easy to capture, or do we define what is essential to protect? Do we compete with AI in efficiency, or do we claim our irreplaceable role as the architects of human agency? Because here is the only thing that I know with certainty, ladies and gentlemen. AI will become more capable, it will become more fluent, and it will become more convenient. But it will never be able to determine what makes a life worth living. It will never be able to sit with you in the uncertainty of becoming. It will never be able to tell you what you should care about when everything around you is being optimized and nothing matters. I mean, that is not a technology problem. That is a human question. And human questions require human answers. We cannot automate wisdom and experience. We cannot optimize meaning. We cannot engineer purpose. But we can protect capacity to pursue them. We can design systems that preserves agency and facilitates autonomy instead of eroding it. We can build interventions that strengthen authorship instead of outsourcing it. And we can choose to measure what matters instead of measuring what is easy. We can build a field that protects human agency instead of outsourcing it. Ladies and gentlemen, we are not the generation that will perfect well-being, but we are the generation that will protect our capability and our capacity to define it. And if we do our work really well, if we claim this moment in this space, if we choose to be the architects instead of spectators, future generations will not ask why we were afraid of the things that AI would take away from us. They will ask how we found the wisdom to protect what only humans can give. Thank you very much.